you. First of all, I'm very honored. Am I too loud? Okay, I'm very honored to be able to present here. Because the rest of the program is amazing, so I hope I won't disappoint. I will be talking about retrocausation and mainly about whether it's a conceptually coherent concept. Because I think most of the recent literature about retrocausality has been focused on its physical possibility, but there are still a lot of philosophers who think the concept itself is ridiculous, completely absurd, not possible. So I would like to go back to that debate a bit. And the main argument against retrocausality is the bilking argument, and I think it captures the intuition that a lot of people have that retrocausality is absurd, and then turns it into this substantive metaphysical argument. And because it sort of uses that intuition that we all have, it's very powerful, I think. But then I hope to show that actually it fails. And it does not actually show that retrocausality is incoherent. And I will do that by presenting an analogous argument of the bilking argument, but then for force causation. And I think there it's very obvious that the argument and the whole setup of the argument does not work. So my aim is to reject the bilking argument as a threat to retrocausality by developing an analog argument of the bilking argument for forward causation. I will briefly talk about what the idea of retrocausation is, quite crucial. I will talk about why it's very interesting to look at this crazy concept. And I will also use a bit of interventionism to make more clear what the problem is with the bilking argument, which I will then first present and then present my analogous argument. And then I will end with the key mistake, also an obvious objection to what I have to say, and a conclusion. So the idea of retrocausation, it was first introduced by Michael Dummett, and he was thinking maybe there are scenarios where it is rational to say or rational to believe that these are scenarios where retrocausality is involved. And that will tell us a lot more about the basic concept of causality. And the idea is that an effect occurs prior to its cause. So to illustrate it, then this is of course not possible. First my pen drops on the floor and then later I drop it. That's of course not possible, but maybe there are scenarios where it makes sense to say retrocausality is involved. So first we have the effect event 1, and then only later we have the cause event 2. This appears to be absurd. The past has already happened, so we cannot affect it. Also, it means that what I do now might have a causal influence with respect to the past. That seems very strange. It's important to keep in mind that it's not about changing the past, but more about determining or bringing about the past. But still, I think the general intuition is, I think, nicely formulated by view. The efforts of a madman trying to find an unmarried husband. It's inherent to this concept of causality that first we act and then later something follows as a result of that act. So let's see whether this is really that ridiculous. Why is it interesting to look at this concept and the conceptual possibility of retrocausality? Well, first, I think it can increase our general understanding of causation, and especially whether the temporal direction is essential to causation. So when you look at a lot of definitions of causation, almost all of them use this temporal notion of it's important that first at T1 the event takes place, and then later at T2 another event takes place, and first has a causal influence on the second. But they never really explain why it's that crucial that we have this temporal direction. So I think this can really show us whether it's crucial, and if so, why. Because that's more than an intuition, it's not really a lot clearer than that. And secondly, I think it's very interesting that the interventionist account of causation does not explicitly mention a temporal direction. That's also why I think it's useful for this argument in this paper. And then finally, retrocausation can potentially explain the much discussed results of Bell's theorem, which states that quantum mechanics is incompatible with locality. And the principle of locality states that the idea is the idea that a particle can only be influenced by its immediate surroundings. And quantum mechanics seems to violate this, which is also very well confirmed. So this seems to lead to the conclusion that we maybe have to accept some form of non-locality, which it is argued that you are then committed to a form of retrocausation. This is not like there are people who argue otherwise, but it does sort of make it interesting to look at least at whether retrocausality is possible. And if not, that's also very informative in this whole debate. As I mentioned, I will also use interventionism. I guess you're all quite familiar with it. It's also, we don't need it in depth, but we will use it a bit. So the basic idea is that X is the cause of Y, if and only if there is a possible intervention on X that will change Y, when all other variables besides X and Y are held fixed at some value. So when you intervene, you manipulate the value of the cause and only of the cause. And I think as a nice illustration of what you do when you intervene, I want to contrast it to when you observe something. So when you observe something, you observe whether B happens or not. It gives you information about that probably its cause also took place if it happened, and you will know that probably the effect of B will also take place. Well, if you intervene and force B to happen, you break its ties to its potential cause, or its original cause, you break these ties, and we see whether C changes accordingly or not. And if so, B has this causal influence on C, and if there's no connection, if C doesn't change, won't change B, there doesn't seem to be a causal connection. I think this is all we need, and I hope it's clear. There are two important notes here. As I already mentioned, this temporal direction, it doesn't really seem to rely on this particular temporal direction here. So that's something we can play with. And it's also important to note, it states it's a cause if there's a possible intervention, then what is a possible intervention? There's also a lot of discussion about this. But what at least Wüthrich says, he said it's not limited to actual manipulation, so to the capabilities of human agents or physical possibilities. It's fine if we break some physical laws. Not, of course, if you want to discuss the physical possibility of retrocausality, then you want to maintain these physical laws. But for causation as a concept, all we need is this possible intervention. It's quite free. So, okay, I hope this is all clear. We can get started with the bilking argument. As I mentioned, one of the most influential arguments against retrocausality. It's put forward by Max Black. And it first starts with two conditions that have to be satisfied if you want to say retrocausality is involved. So first we have two events here. We have, event one is the first event, that's sort of the supposed effect event, and then later we have the supposed cause event. And what we need is that the second event is caused by factors that are independent of E1, otherwise the first event seems to be the cause of the second event instead of the other way around. And the second condition is that the first event is not sufficiently caused by any prior events, so we actually need E2 as a cause for the first event to happen. I hope this is clear, then we can get started with the argument. So suppose there is a correlation between the earlier event and the later event, and it seems to be the case that the second event has a causal influence on the first. Then we have two options. So from the first condition, it seems to be possible for the second event to disagree with the first event. So we observe whether the first event takes place or not. Then since E2 is caused by factors that are independent of this first event, we can prevent E2 from happening, you can make E2 happening. That's independent of whether you want happens or not. But that makes that they can maybe disagree. So suppose we observe that the first event took place, we prevent the second event from happening. If the first event did not take place, then we make sure that the second event does happen. But if this is indeed possible, as required by the first condition, then there seems to be no causal connection between the two events. We break the correlation. The alternative is that this is not possible somehow. But then, the causal antecedents of the second event are not independent of the first event. So the first condition is violated, and it seems like the first event is a cause of the second event. It depends somehow on P1. So we seem to have forwards causation instead of retrocausation. So either way, there's no retrocausation. And Max Planck concludes it's an incoherent concept. Its conditions are always violated. Then Dummett presents an example that he actually uses to make clear that maybe there are scenarios where we say it's rational to believe in retrocausality. I would like to use it here to show how the bilking argument would work applied to this example. And I will not go into the details of what he is arguing then later. I will hint towards it a bit later on. But for now, let's use it as an illustration of the bilking argument. It's the example of the tribal hunt. So suppose we come across a tribe with the following custom. Every second year, the young warriors of the tribe are sent as part of their initiation ritual on a lion hunt. They have to prove their bravery. They travel for 2 days, hunt lions for 2 days, and spend 2 days on the return journey. And observers go with them and report to the chief upon their return whether the young warriors acquitted themselves with bravery or not. While the young warriors are away from the village, the chief performs ceremonies, dances, intended to cause the warriors to act bravely. We notice that the chief continues to perform these dances for the whole 6 days that the party is away. That is to say, for 2 days during which the events that the dancing is supposed to influence have already taken place. Because for the final 2 days they only travel back home, so they already completed the hunt. But somehow it seems to be crucial that the chief still does his ceremony dancing, because there was also once a chief who only danced for the first 4 days, and then the results of the hunt were disastrous. No lions had been killed. So this is like a weird story, probably it's not ever going to happen. But suppose it does. Then Dummett says it's rational to believe retrocausality is involved. So let's see how the bilking argument would work applied to this. Okay, so suppose we observe that the hunters have been brave, or at least the observers observe, because there are observers there. And suppose one of the observers quickly goes on a bicycle, I'm Dutch, so let's say bicycle, and quickly cycles to the chief, and then tries to intervene on the value of D, on the dancing of the chief, such that he disagrees with the value of H. So, suppose they have been brave, then this observer tries to prevent the chief from dancing, make him stop before the 6 days have ended. And suppose this is possible, it seems very likely that this is possible if the dancing of the chief does not rely on the success of the hunt. So that's the first option. But then this means we have broken the correlation, there doesn't seem to be any causation involved, no forwards, no backwards. The second option is that this is not possible, this somehow constantly fails. Then it does not seem possible to intervene on the value of the dancing in a way that does not rely on the hunt. This is very strange. I guess that's just a scenario. Then there's no forwards causation. It seems like there's forwards causation, no backwards causation. Either way, no retro causation involved. That is then how the bilking argument would go. And then I will argue that it is defective by focusing on a scenario of forwards causation, where we know there's forwards causation, but then the bilking argument would say there isn't. So I want to focus on smoking and lung cancer as an example. We know that smoking, very simplified, causes lung cancer, but let's see what happens when we follow the structure of the bilking argument. So suppose the value of C is given. Maybe there is at some point we discover a genetic indicator that very reliably can say that some people are very likely to get lung cancer at some point. And then suppose we intervene on smoking, on the value of S, and we try to make it disagree with the value of C of cancer. And suppose we successfully intervene on S, so we focus on this group we know will get lung cancer, and we either try to make them stop smoking or prevent them from smoking, so that the value of smoking is 0. But that means that they don't smoke and do get lung cancer, so there seems to be no causal connection between these two scenarios. The second possibility is that we try to intervene on S, but this constantly fails. So somehow, whether these people smoke relies on whether they will get lung cancer or not, because the value of S always seems to be dependent on the value of C somehow. But then it seems like there's retrocausality involved instead of forwards causation. Either way, there is no causation from smoking to lung cancer. But we know something goes wrong here because we know smoking causes lung cancer. So what goes wrong? Here the problem is that the value of C is already determined. We only focus on this group of people who we know will get lung cancer in the end. So the supposed effect has been given a determinate value. But then if we look again at the characterization of a cause in interventionism, we say that we want to intervene on X and see whether the value of Y changes or not. If so, X is a cause of Y. But then if we already set Y to a certain value, we can no longer see whether changing X results in a change in Y, because Y cannot be changed. So in this scenario, we want to see whether a change in the value of S of smoking will result in a change in the value of C, in whether people will get cancer or not. But this is not possible if the value of C is already determined, and this makes it impossible to establish smoking as a cause of lung cancer. I think this is quite obvious, it's trivial, but then this is exactly what happens in the bilking argument. In this case, for forwards causation, we know smoking is a cause of lung cancer, but it's just a setup of this argument that does not allow us to infer this causal connection. And I think the same is going on in the bilking argument. So to establish whether the dancing of the chief later on is a virtual cause of the hunt, of a successful hunt, we need to change the value of the dancing and see whether this results in a change in the value of the hunt. This is not possible if the value of the hunt is already determined. But that's exactly the starting point of the bilking argument. We determine the value of the supposed effect. So this makes it directly impossible to establish whether the dancing influences the hunt. But as in the case of smoking causing lung cancer, it does not mean that there is no causal connection. It just means that this setup does not allow us to infer it. There is an obvious objection. You could say for forwards causation, the value of the supposed effect E is not given before the value of the supposed cause C. But for retrocausality, the value of the effect always seems to be given before the value of the cause. So it's impossible to establish a retrocausal connection. Then I would like to reply that this does not mean that retrocausation is an incoherent notion, and that is what a lot of people think. It's just this absurd contradictory notion. That's also what the bilking argument wants to show, that it always leads to a contradiction. You assume conditions that in the end have to be violated by those conditions. So all we can establish from the bilking argument is sort of this common sense fact that we cannot establish a causal connection if the value of the effect is fixed independently of manipulating the cause. So perhaps it is impossible to establish a retrocausal connection, but it does not mean there are no retrocausal connections. And this also, it's not yet my conclusion, but it's a first step. It also depends on what kind of account of causation you have, whether it's very agent-centered or not. I think especially when you have a non-agent-centered account of causality, it just shows that we are not capable of inferring all connections. But when you sort of look at more this block universe perspective, that is more symmetric. But then also if you have a more agent-centered account, because then you might be inclined to say, okay, it's just impossible to establish retrocausal connections, but because causation is inherently tied to our epistemic capabilities, it just means there is no retrocausality. But that's also not true. Then we have Michael Dummett and Price. They have both presented some conditions such that retrocausality might be possible. So Michael Dummett proposed a condition that says that the agent has no epistemic access to the occurrence of the effect event E, independently of any intention to bring it about. I have argued in my first paper of my PhD thesis that this is not sufficient because it really relies on that sort of the acting agent here has no epistemic access, but then you get a really weird account of causation where there's that we can we never have to agree on whether there's a causal connection or not. It only relies on my epistemic access and not on your epistemic access. I think that's weird. Anyway, so then we have Price. A slightly weaker condition. He says the agent cannot gain epistemic access to the occurrence of event E independently of any intention to bring it about, and without altering E from what it would have been had no epistemic access been gained. So this allows for the possibility of agents observing the past, but then by doing so, they immediately destroy any retrocausal relationships. So for both, what is crucial is that as long as we don't know what has been going on in the past, it is rational to think we might have a retrocausal influence on it. And then Price will add to it, and when we do get epistemic access, we immediately destroy the causal connection, retrocausal connection. And then this is again very relevant for quantum mechanics, where by observing the system, you immediately interfere with the system. So then, to conclude here, there are scenarios where there could be retrocausal influences. So my conclusion then is that the bilking argument does not establish that retrocausation is incoherent. I think it just states this obvious fact that starting with the determinate effect value makes it directly impossible to establish a potential retrocausal or causal connection. And there are scenarios then where there maybe could be retrocausal influences. Thank you.
No, I'm not going to use any slides, but should I maybe take the microphone? Do you have a... Not yours. I think there's another. Oh, yeah, here it is. Thank you very much. So I should start by making clear that I find the piece of paper, very interesting and very novel in that she really tries to push the symmetry or asymmetry between forward and backward causation further by drawing the parallel between forward and backward causation in much sharper relief than it is even with Dummett or Price or anybody else as I've seen beforehand. Now, the article's been very clearly presented. I'm not going to go over it again, it's not necessary. And I should mention that I agree with what I take to be the two main theses. So the main conclusion can sort of be split into two main theses that is defended, namely first, that the bilking argument does not establish the incoherence of retrocausality, which is the first part of the first conclusion, I guess it's this one, but also with a further conclusion for which you argued in the paper explicitly, that there could be circumstances in which we ought to infer to a retrocausal connection. That's the second main point. So, I'm rather completely convinced, and therefore I can only offer really boring comments, I'm afraid. So, if you were hoping for some sort of adversarial the considerations, your considerations, in a way that hopefully will bring out a bit more clearly the symmetries and asymmetries that are relevant in assessing the two and contrasting the two cases. So I think there's an important distinction that we can make between epistemology and metaphysics. So there's questions about what we can know, and maybe sort of together with that a sort of a methodological asymmetry, namely what we can intervene on, and that sort of I think in those realms it's very normal to think, and very natural to think that there's an asymmetry there immediately. There's an asymmetry of knowledge. We can know the past, we cannot know the future. If that's removed, then the two cases become much more parallel. There's an asymmetry of agency. We can interfere on the present such as to somehow affect the future, it seems, but not change sort of past events. That would be incoherent. So because we sort of bring to those sort of asymmetries to the table, we then infer to sort of the metaphysical, to some sort of metaphysical asymmetry, if you want. That's not necessarily there. If we put these epistemic and agential asymmetries to the side and just look at the bare metaphysics, we should start with the question whether there is an asymmetry between two events or maybe two event types, right? And either, there are two possibilities. Either there is no such correlation, in which case I think it's pretty straightforward that there's no causation, retro or otherwise, just as in the case of Max Planck's original argument. But of course there could be a correlation. There could be some sort of robust correlation that's maintained. In which case we then have the following possibilities as I see it, from which we can choose. Either there's direct forward causation, direct backward causation, there's somehow a common cause which correlates the two event types, or maybe some sort of more complicated causal structure that results in a correlation. Now if we rule out with Max Planck the common cause scenarios and the more complicated causal structures, then I think we're left with two possibilities. It's, forward and backward causation. And I think there's nothing incoherent about, so this is just further word to say I agree with you, there's nothing incoherent with them maintaining a sort of a metaphysical openness about whether there is in the metaphysics itself a symmetry or an asymmetry. Perhaps we can introduce an asymmetry at the metaphysical level because we are committed. Otherwise, we have other theoretical commitments to an asymmetry. We could be growing block metaphysicians, or maybe shrinking block metaphysicians for that matter, which would entail that our metaphysics comes with a commitment to an asymmetry. That would allow us to break the symmetry that's otherwise present. But unless that's the case, it's prima facie absolutely an open possibility that we might be rationally justified in referring to a retrocausal relation rather than a forward causal one. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so we've got plenty of time for Q&A. Sorry. Yeah, I forgot completely the response. You're welcome to respond to these questions. There wasn't much challenge to you in it. So,
thank you.
We'll move straight on.
Yeah.
Okay, Mike is first.
You can hear me. I can do it good. Okay, so in your, it's recorded? Okay. Can you hear me? Does that work? So if you go back one slide, there it is. If you go one slide to the,
Which slide?
yeah, this one. all of these are about agents in their epistemic access to the effect.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if a more general condition would require some kind of causal, because when you're doing a manipulation as the counter-causation, there are constraints on the manipulations that require you to do some edge cutting, right? To make the only edge going into the manipulated variable come from the intervention. Yeah, I was wondering if you could have constraints on that require the manipulation or intervention variable not to be downstream of the effect. So instead of having like an epistemic constraint, have like change the requirements for the intervention. Does that make sense?
You want to change the requirements for the intervention? Well, I think you just need a completely sort of different setup. So for my first paper, I tried to establish the general condition for the possibility of retrocausation. So then I also discussed these, and I think, especially for the first one, it's really weird to focus on the epistemic access of the single acting agent. So actually, Dummett, he proposes this condition in relation to the tribal hunt example that I mentioned. So he says, as long as the chief does not know whether the hunters have been brave or not, it's rational for him to believe he has a retrocausal influence. That's really weird, because then the hunters know whether they have been successful in their hunt. The observers know whether the hunters have been successful in their hunt. For them, it's completely irrational to believe any retrocausality is involved. They already know, we've killed a lion, why are you not stopping? Why are you not stopping to dance? Because you can. I mean, chill out. We have a lion. So I wanted to get away from sort of this epistemic access of the acting agent. But I think this paper makes it even more clear what the problem is. So now I want to go back to my previous paper and see what to do. So what I already had as a condition was there sort of a principled lack of epistemic access, or like, yeah. What you need is that the value of the effect is not already fixed or determined prior to the cause sort of happening. But then, because it's earlier in time, you need to have something there. So I'm not sure yet sort of how to formulate that into a specific condition, but I think that, yeah, that is what you need. And I think there has to be a reason, so you have to have a reason for this, why you have this principled lack of epistemic access, not just for me, not just for you, but for everyone, to the value of this effect prior to whether the cause of that happens or not. But then you're not giving a condition, you just say what you want, but how? So I don't know yet exactly how to do that, but yeah, I hope this answers it.
I was thinking one way to, I like that, that does help a lot. I was thinking maybe one way to talk about the effect not having been fixed before you do the intervention would be to say that the intervention can't be a causal descendant of the effect. But that might not be does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah. I will write this down because I always think, oh, this is very interesting, I will remember this. And I won't. Intervention is not a causal descendant of the effect, right?
That's what I was, yeah, that's the kind of thing I was thinking.
Of the cause or of the?
The effect. So, these are all epistemic. The epistemic access comes from the effect causing the belief of the agent.
Yeah.
So we're,
Yeah, I want to think about this, but I think because you want the intervention, sort of, you use the intervention to manipulate the cause, and the cause should have an influence on the effect. So if then, sort of, I think it's, is definitely a requirement that the intervention does not rely on the effect because then you go in a circle. That's not what you want anyways. But yeah, it's definitely food for thought of how to move forward here. Yeah, thank you.
I'll ask one of those morning mics then.
Fair enough, yeah.
I actually have a question for the audience. Just that discussion made me think about if you feel like there's any repercussions for decision theory, because you know, I've got a two box inclinations with you know the Newcomb's situation where I go into the
Yeah. I actually thought of focusing on that for third paper, but I have no thoughts about this yet. But it's definitely connected to it.
Yeah, because I mean, I guess the thought is like, if I'm standing there as a two box thinking, well, I'll take both the boxes because of causal decision theorists. But now you're persuading me that I should, you know, be concerned about the possibility of retrocausation. Now I don't really know what decision to make. Does that prevent me from being called a decision theorist, or does it mean I still am called a decision? I don't know.
It's definitely interesting. So my supervisor told me about this one. Okay, if I remember correctly, it's you have two boxes, and then in the one box there's €1,000 and another 100 or something, and then if you
One is transparent.
sorry.
One is transparent and the other is.
Oh, that's also another thing. Yeah, and okay, tell me more.
So like an incredibly brilliant predictive machine has decided whether you're going to take both boxes or only one box. You know you'll get but one box is opaque, and you don't know whether you know it's €1 million or nothing at all. And then the other one is transparent and there's €100. And you go into the room, the door is shut, and you can come out with whatever you like. No one can intervene on what's in the boxes once you're inside. At least that's what you think, because you're going to be retrocausation. So even though the box is decided, so the predictive machine, I'm sorry I'm screwing this up for everybody.
One box or two boxes.
Right, the box will, the machine will decide to put the €1 million in the opaque box only if it predicts that you will, only not take it.
Yeah, I also.
No, not take the transparent box. But when you're, so you know that if you take both boxes, it's likely that you're the kind of person that the machine's predicted such that it won't put the money in the opaque box. But once you're in there, you're like, well, the machine can't influence what I do now, so I should just take both boxes because that will maximise the amount of money I get. Anyway.
Yeah, it's I remember that my supervisor told me that, and then I was working on this for a year, and I can tell you that if you work on retrocausality for a year, it's like very normal. It's like, why is this a problem at all? And sort of your whole intuition gets mixed up. So then I think, of course, of course you do this. But then people say, but there's no retrocausality. Yeah, that's not normal for people to do.
And it might raise some more general questions about how you get evidence for retrocausality.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting problem.
So just following on from that last point, I mean, if I remember what Price says in his Lugano point correctly, he agrees with you that it's impossible to establish directly that retrocausation occurs. I mean, first of all, these retrocausal scenarios and suggest, well, for any of them, we could interpret these phenomena in forward causal terms. Right? There's always an option. So I was just going to ask you, so if you're an old-fashioned interventionist, here's how you find out about causation, and that route's blocked, then are there any circumstances in which you should posit retrocausation, and if so, why?
If you should go for retrocausation.
Yeah, if it's never forced on you by a direct interventionist argument.
Well, first of all, but that's I think personal preference. I feel like I want to know what is going on, not just what all you can say about what is going on. So that's first of all what I'm interested in. Like, can it actually take place? Is it? I think that would be my main sort of thing, is that you want to see. So if you don't want to miss this whole part of the world that is there, and we just, because we are so limited in our thinking, just refuse to look at it. I think that is, but that's just also why it's interesting for me, and not per se relevant as a philosophical paper, but just that I think, it's interesting to explore these crazy things that might happen in the world, and let's see if they do. But as a scientist, then you need maybe a different reason for it. Then I still think, if you look at now the debate in quantum mechanics, where you have this problem with Bell's incompatibility between non-locality, between locality and sorry, I'm tired of that presentation. I think in that scenario it's actually very relevant to use it, and it's very natural that we are sort of forced to go down the route of retrocausality instead of normal causality.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But I hope there might be other scenarios as well. I doubt there are, because you really need this strange situation where the effect is not yet determined before the cause is determined, and sort of on a microscopic level that never really happens. So.
I don't know, you need not to be determined, or just that you have some, in principle, academic experts?
Well, that I don't know, because I also don't want it to be about, that's also, again, personal preference. I don't want it to be about that we lack epistemic access, because that could also be like a coincidental thing, you know? But determined is also like a tricky word and stuff. One thing I was thinking about, or someone told me that maybe in law it happens. So sometimes you have sort of this new law, and then they say, now I cannot think of the proper words, but they say, okay, we started now, but then it also counts for the past 5 years or something.
Mm-hmm.
So then
things become illegal retrospectively.
Yeah, exactly. So then I thought, it seems to maybe happen in the social realm as well, in some groups.
Lugano?
I mean, this is some sort of frank suggestion, I guess, but I was wondering, one could also say that, so if you take a broadly union account, and you have like the human mosaic, then you have something like a best system account over laws. The laws also tells you which one are the causal relation, causal connection. And it seems that in principle we don't have really a priori reasons to rule out the scenarios in which the best way to summarize the mosaic is with retrocausal connection. And then, I mean, you can also have a more substantive metaphysical causation, but still agree on the epistemology of the union. So, in order to individual retrocausal connection that are more substantial than the human thing, we still need to look at the mosaic and whatever. Then, of course, we can have a substantive notion of causation that also contrasts with retrocausation independently, maybe because of the thing that Chris was saying, like there is a directionality that is inherited by the direction of time, which is actually dependent. But as long as you don't have that, it looks like it's the burden of the proof. And as long as this scenario is not bad for the reason, and it's like it's a good epistemic type for the causal connection, it looks like in principle it should be possible to have causal connection, rate of causation.
Yeah. Is there a question?
No, well, that's not whether you have anything against this. I expect no, maybe yes.
I have not yet thought about that in this respect. Maybe this is something else to add, I don't know, but sure.
So I was thinking I might follow those with this discussion, this question is kind of what it could be rational to believe
believe the retrocausalation occur, even if it's kind of conceptually clear that it does occur. And this idea, Peter was proposing that it might be that kind of in any given case, we've got the kind of possibility of an interpretation that's forward causal and the option of a direction causal, that maybe it's kind of undetermined. But kind of thinking about the contrived hunt case, it might be that like the hypothesis that the cheat's action is retrocausally affecting things is kind of unified, and it can apply across a very wide range of the different cases. It's always the same explanation for each case. But in the case where there's like a forward causal explanation, the hunt in each case, they would be kind of very varied and disparate, those forwards. So we might want to kind of sort of unificationist kind of inference that we've got kind of one inference pattern, the retrocausal one that can explain everything, versus the many different varied, looks like a coincidence if we go for the forward causal route. So I think that's a justification for preferring a retrocausal inference pattern, not just kind of allowing it.
Michael discusses this option actually in his text.
So good.
Michael in his text of type 1 example says, of course, it's always a possible scenario where over and over again there's this other reason for why the test of the cheat seems to rely on the hunt that actually it's just a coincidence, but over and over again there's this reason for it, it's coincidental that there's this correlation. And then we say, this is also an explanation that we want. But maybe, if you're happy with it, I don't know, I think it's weird. I mean, also what you want is you want to be able to make predictions around the world. That's why you want things also relationships. So, if you sort of, then you get like more this human mosaic where things just happen and, you try to convert causal relationships and actually they're not really there, it's just correlation.
There it might be the kind of, if one is looking for kind of to find the causal factor in the Kooiman situation, predictive power is kind of prioritized because we want our laws to be very predictive, whereas maybe anti-Kooiman might take a different approach and kind of value unification in the predictive patterns of the world more than kind of raw predictive power. So maybe there's a sense in which kind of what conceptual draws you have. Any more comments to say? Well, I think the setup is ready for the coffee break, so thanks again to